I'm joined today by Professor Geoff Pearson of the University of Manchester. He's got a PhD titled Legal Responses to Football Crowd Disorder. He's worked and advised UEFA, FIFA, the English Football League, the UK Home Office, number of books out, his most recent, A New Agenda for Football Crowd Management. So thank you very much for joining me, Geoff.
Pleasure to be here.
Ultras, that's what this episode's all about. It seems to be something that, I don't know if it ever went away, but it seems to be a lot in the news recently. Just a couple of days ago, we had Luciano Spalletti, coach of Napoli, obviously the one of Scudetto. He was, in October 2021, his car was stolen, and then there was a banner put up saying, "We'll give you back your Fiat Panda as long as you leave." Obviously, he's went on to success, and the Ultras this week came to the Napoli training centre holding up a banner, and they returned his steering wheel and his Pino Daniele, who's an Italian singer, CDs. They're all sort of masked up, hooded, dressed in black. Apparently, after the camera stopped rolling, they took the masks off. Another recent one was Inter's wing-back Federico Di Marco. He was caught sort of mouthing something to the fans on the pitch. So the Ultras put up a banner outside his house saying, "Focus on playing or we'll make you swallow that tongue of yours." We also saw Alkmaar's Ultras attack West Ham's fans in the UEFA Conference League. So there's been quite a few things happen of recent. Where do you think we are in the Ultra scene at the moment?
It's a difficult question because there's not just one type of ultra and not just one type of ultra group. Primarily, the ultra movement is about creating atmosphere and creating solidarity within a club support and providing protection for that club's fans, particularly when they travel away from home. But club ultras also are meant to reflect the locality of the team and are meant to do good works as well. We see them involved in things like food banks and raising money after there've been natural disasters in those locations and things like that. So originally, if you look at Italian ultras, there is a very specific ultra code, which, for example, says you're not meant to use violence except in self-defense, and you're meant to look after the weaker supporters in your organisation. Who follow the club and things like that. So when the ultra movement spread, and particularly when it spread east, we started to see elements of the ultra culture, for want of a better expression, travel, but not some of those rules and that sort of self-regulation. And there's undoubtedly ultra groups that are connected to violence and ultra group leaders that are connected to organised crime in parts of Eastern Europe and extreme politics as well. So very difficult, depending on where you are, what your ultra group is doing, what's driving it, and whether it's essentially a force for good or a force for evil.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that's maybe troubled me or concerned me is that, we're now seeing sort of smaller teams, and I'll take an example from Scotland. Maybe a lot of people listen to this, football fans might know the team, might not, but they're called St Johnstone, small team, and they've got a ultra group called Fair City Unity. Now, I'm not suggesting that they do anything wrong, but when you go on their social media, they all tend to be young men, all dressed in black, and their faces are blurred. And there's even a picture of them giving their Player of the Year award to one of the players, and he's holding his young child. Her face is blurred, the player's face is not blurred, and everyone else's face is blurred of the Ultras. And I just feel this idea of dressing in black, blurring your face, your identity, I just wonder why it's necessary. I just think it gives a kind of sinister, slightly aggressive feeling when you're not part of that group. And it sort of troubles me that maybe fans feel they have to do that.
But I mean, football fans who particularly travel away from home, young male football fans, have been involved in that kind of activity since the late 1950s. Mid to late 1950s is when we first started getting reports in this country of young, mostly male football fans causing trouble, maybe covering their faces with scarves, dressing in a similar way, banding together and acting in a way which demonstrated internal solidarity, but which was there for two purposes. One, it was there for the individuals in that group themselves, so that they felt that they had a home, but also it was an expression of identity to everybody else. For everybody else, it was, look, we're a group, you are outside this group. Be careful of us, treat us with respect, because we've got the numbers, we've got the powers. Things can go ugly if you confront us and make things difficult for us. And of course, other groups would travel together in a as a purely defensive tactic. Away fans are quite frequently attacked, and being in large numbers and having a reputation that, or looking like you can look after yourself and that you're forced to be reckoned with, is one of the ways to try and protect yourselves and ensure that you're not going to get a battering. So these aren't new developments. The way in which the ultra scene has been borrowed in England, Scotland and Wales is something relatively new, and I think that is largely driven by social media, by YouTube. I think fans look at what the ultras do abroad, particularly in terms of atmosphere, and they look at that and they think that's authentic fandom. That's what authentic fans do. Football on these islands is too commercial, it's too stale. Therefore, we are going to attempt to borrow that authenticity and make football grounds a bit more interesting, a bit more lively. We're going to try and make our home grounds a little bit more intimidating for clubs that come and play here. So in one sense, yeah, it's new, some of the things, particularly use of pyrotechnics, say maybe be blurring our faces on photographs, maybe attempts to cover faces. But at the same time, a lot of what is actually going on here, fans have been doing for over half a century in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. Maybe my question was slightly vague, but you were saying about maybe clubs in the UK and the British Isles sort of adopting this kind of ultra thing. And I wonder, and I also wanted to get your opinion on, do you think a lot of understand maybe the history of maybe there is a sinister side, maybe there has been violence by some ultras, maybe sometimes their previous ultras have been right wing, because they're attaching themselves to a movement. Do you think they appreciate some of the historical elements and maybe outside of the UK, the things that they're attaching themselves to by referring to themselves as ultras and maybe mimicking parts of these other groups' behaviour and actions?
Well, I think there's a lot of confusion about who is in what ultra group abroad, and ultras has been used by the media in this country to refer to violent groups abroad, almost just to mean hooligans, essentially. So when we have clubs of English or Scottish clubs that have travelled abroad and got into trouble, it's become, talking about the ultras attacking them in a bar has become shorthand, when actually, when you ask the questions at those localities, the ultra groups will say, this wasn't an ultra group. These weren't people from our ultra groups. And look at the ultra code, particularly in Italy, it says you shouldn't do this. Now, whether or not that is true is another matter, but I think it is much more complicated than the idea that you just have an ultra group and they both set off the pyrotechnics and also stab people. So I think that's the first thing. I mean, the other thing is the politics. There are right-wing ultra groups. You can look at clubs like Lazio, for example. But there's also left-wing ultra groups. If you look at clubs like Livorno, for example, or San Paoli, there are left-wing ultra groups. And then there are some clubs who have both left-wing and right-wing ultra groups, such as Roma. Actually, the vast bulk of clubs who have ultra groups, those ultra groups are non-political. Even if you've got a club that's based in an area which is considered predominantly right-wing or predominantly left-wing, most of the ultra groups avow themselves as being non-political. And actually, when we look at the ultra groups in this country, they tend to be more left-wing. So if we look at groups like the Green Brigade, for example, we look at groups like the sort of Celtic, if we look at the Holmesdale Fanatics at Crystal Palace, these are groups which are predominantly left-leaning groups. And they have used their power to try and force their club to accommodate them being allowed to make atmosphere for the club. And so, you know, the Holmesdale Fanatics don't go around attacking people. The Green Brigade, as an organisation, don't go around attacking people. What they do is they put pressure on the club to try and give them a space to make atmosphere. And that's ultimately why the likes of Crystal Palace put up with the Holmesdale Fanatics, because that's where the noise comes from at Crystal Palace.
Yeah, I mean, everyone sort of comments on that, don't they? That the English, in the sort of English Premiership, or that's where the atmosphere is. Crystal Palace always sort of picked out, and like you say, it's coming from that group of fans. I mean, talking about the ultras, they're obviously quite secretive, and I've sort of maybe hammered the point home about the blowing the face and things like that. But do you think by being that secretive or slightly stepping away, that it causes this maybe mislabeling and assumption of, oh, you're all attached to violence, or maybe you're more right wing than maybe you are? Do you think if they opened up a bit and maybe let people in, there would be a greater understanding, or do you think maybe the media doesn't want to do that and is quite happy to label them, what they're being labelled?
I think it's certainly possible. Being a secretive group and not letting the media in will always make the media suspicious of your motives, in the same way as it'll make the police suspicious of your motives. And poor policing operations that don't understand what non-violent ultra groups do are often very suspicious of them and often follow them around and use intelligence gathering tactics and don't engage with them in the way that they should do. So there is a lot of mistrust, because these groups essentially don't want to welcome in outsiders, because that's their purpose. They don't trust outsiders. They don't trust the people that are running football. They think they've ruined football, taken away the atmosphere, priced out the local fans. They don't trust the police, because they think that the police again arrest people for doing nothing and look to fit them up with football banning orders, for example. So there is an element of distrust from both sides here, and that's problematic. And if the ultra groups let those let the police, let the leagues and the clubs understand them more, possibly that would get rid of some of the suspicion. But in some instances, you can guarantee that there would be times when individuals within those groups ended up being banned from grounds. So there are very good reasons why the ultra groups are quite secretive in that way.
In terms of maybe ultras liaising with clubs, is there more sort of back and forth than we assume? I mean, I know in Italy, recently we had AC Milan, the ultras weren't happy, and the sort of team had to go over to the side of the pitch and almost sort of apologise for their performances and sort of almost like school children, taking it from a teacher. But in terms, even in Britain, do you think there is more contact between ultras and the club? Maybe it's done at the limelight, or is it very much we do our thing and you listen to us?
No. There's a lot of talk behind the scenes, and of course, not all of these atmosphere-generating organisations call themselves ultras. If you think about organisations like the Red Army at Manchester United, for example, they don't consider themselves to be an ultra group, but they create the atmosphere. And when it comes to cup finals, for example, there is dialogue between the club and that fan group to make sure that there is a block of those fans in the area behind the goal all together, so that firstly you're going to get some kind of atmosphere at Wembley, which is notoriously difficult to get any atmosphere in, but secondly, so that those fans aren't all going to be migrating around to try and stand in an area where there may not be enough space for them. So ticketing is the main area through which these groups in this country and abroad negotiate with the club, and it's in the club's interest to negotiate with those groups, because if you don't, they will look to stand and group together anyway, and if they can't stand and group together, that club doesn't get any atmosphere, or gets much less atmosphere at its matches. And there is a link between the atmosphere that your fans make and results on the pitch. So it should work for all parties, really. And that includes the police, because if you've got an area which is taken over by a particular ultra group and a problem occurs in that area, then you know where to look to try and respond to it. And in places like Italy, for example, the ultras themselves at some clubs take responsibility for distribution of tickets for matches in certain sections or for away matches. And there will also be tight links and perhaps an overlap between ultra groups and a club supporter liaison officer. Okay, so UEFA rules say that any club participating in European competition has to have a supporter liaison officer who can act as a go-between between UEFA and the police and the fans attending the event itself. So if you've got an ultra group, your support liaison officer is much more empowered, because they can go to the head of that ultra group and they can say, look, if this doesn't stop, the cops are going to hold it all back for 2 hours after the game, and the ultra groups can regulate. And one of the advantages of having ultra groups, which have an organizational structure where there is respect shown to the leaders, is that they are much more likely to self-regulate. If you don't have that kind of organization, it becomes very difficult to try and get those groups to self-regulate, because you just get lots of little groups of friends or family members or whatever who may be at each other's throats and essentially aren't going to listen to people passing down messages which have ultimately come from people responsibility for their safety and security.
I mean, it's sort of picking that up. I mentioned earlier about the AZ Alkmaar fans and the West Ham and the UEFA Conference League semi-final at the Olympic Stadium in London, and we've all seen the pictures or the videos of the Alkmaar fans all dressed in black, sort of being quite aggressive and sort of violent towards West Ham. So would you expect Alkmaar then to sort of be behind the scenes saying, right, that was totally unacceptable, we won't be giving you tickets to come again, or tone that down? Or will Alkmaar know who those people were? Because obviously their identities it was hard to see them because they had masks and hoods in a lot of cases.
Ultimately, I don't know. I don't know who was in that section where they broke through. I don't know whether that was a section which was full of a known ultra group that was season ticket holders. I don't know if that was just a group where there were lots of lads that wanted a scrap. So difficult to answer that question. Yes, Alkmaar will have to take steps to identify those individuals. And if they don't do that, then the sanction from UEFA should be higher. I think UEFA can do more to sanction clubs who don't respond to these problems significantly. And we could also think about the Real Betis fans at Old Trafford last season, which were, the worst scenes I've seen in Old Trafford for, a decade or so. If the clubs don't play ball, then UEFA should absolutely be taking action against them. UEFA tends to take action against the club whose fans have caused the bother, but then doesn't seem to take any additional action for the club then doing nothing about it. So I think there needs to be more pressure placed on clubs to take action when those incidents happen. Ultimately, what happened at Alkmaar was a complete breakdown of safety and security that was the responsibility of Alkmaar, the police, and also UEFA. And every time I go to a UEFA club match, it is always mayhem. The stewards never know what they're doing. The safety is always compromised. Never feel safe. There are always security protocols in place which don't serve any purpose whatsoever. And as the report into, both Baroness Casey report into what happened at Wembley in July 2021, and then the independent report into what happened in Paris at the Champions League final last year says, someone is going to die at one of these events sooner rather than later. And it won't be the fault of the ultras, it'll be the fault of the organisers.
Why do you think UEFA are so, and this is my word, inept? Because, we seem to, like you say, for the Champions League final, which was horrific scenes in Wembley, and I think there was even some issues in Istanbul at the recent Champions League final with Manchester City, and fans not being able to get in, and 3-hour lines, and people getting frustrated. And why are UEFA seem to get stuck in these problems? Because, they surely have multitude of experience of large games and must have so many experts to call upon. Why do they find themselves in this situation repeatedly?
Well, what happened in Paris was that they essentially handed over authority to the French, who, are the worst organisers of mass events and have arguably the worst police force in Europe for dealing with public order, public safety situations. So they essentially wash their hands of it. They're always going to be in a problem, UEFA, because they don't have their own army, want of a better expression. So they are always reliant upon stewards that are beholden to the club where the match is being played, and that makes sense because they understand things like how you evacuate a particular stand, where the exits are, which direction the fans are going to come from the match, and they're always going to be reliant on the local police force. I think a bigger, the issue for me is, why are UEFA allowing major matches to take place in countries which don't follow the European Convention on hosting football matches with an international dimension? Because that convention sets out key minimum standards, and I could turn up to UEFA tomorrow and tell them which nations meet those standards and which nations don't meet those standards. And once you start to say to countries, you can't host any major finals because your police can't be trusted, then you will start seeing pressure on the police to change their tactics, change the way that they operate. And police forces can do that, and they can do that in a relatively short space of time. And we saw that for the Euro 2004 tournament with the Portuguese police, who completely changed their method of policing within around 6 months, and then to an incredibly successful tournament where I think there was maybe one arrest in a match City for a violent offence in the entire tournament.
You mentioned there that someone like yourself, an expert, could tell UEFA what countries are not able to host this. And you mentioned France there. Is there any other ones that would surprise people? Because I think most people would be surprised that France is not able to do it, because such a large country with a number of large football teams and stadium. I'm surprised to hear they're not equipped to do it properly. Any other ones that stand out for you?
You can pretty much tell if you think about English football fans travelling to tournaments abroad. Okay, the English travelling contingent contain a large number of very mouthy, very unpleasant, very drunk individuals, but they're not going for a fight. And if you police them well, okay, it will pass off. The event will pass off peacefully. But if you police them poorly, there will be a riot. So you can follow the riots and see where the problems lie. And if you think, England's trips to Marseille in 1998, 2016 were both probably the two most major riots involving English fans since Heysel. So straight away you've got a problem, and you only need to look at how the French police protest, because it's the same police that police protests that typically police football. So it's not just a policing football problem that the French have got. The French have got a public order policing issue, which is long-standing and goes back centuries, frankly. That's a well-ingrained problem, and that is a real challenge. But any country which has a standing sort of paramilitary riot police has the potential to cause problems. So Spain, the Carabinieri in Italy, of course, a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe. When you look at good practice, Portugal has sort of oscillated depending on the political will. They have been brilliant. They've also been poor at times. The Brits are pretty good. There's a lot of learning there, a lot of structures in place, and of course we don't have a standing riot police. In the UK, it's your ordinary Bobby on the beat who just has a little bit of extra training and falls into a particular command structure for football events. The Germans are some of the best in the business in terms of managing problematic crowds, and have successfully managed large groups of problematic English supporters, particularly at the World Cup in 2006. Scandinavia and Holland have, despite the Alkmaar issue, of good reputations, whereas in contrast Belgium doesn't. So there's not a sort of one size fits all really, but there are clear directions in the European Convention, and there's clear directions coming from crowd science about how you can successfully manage large groups of challenging football fans. And if you follow those rules, then you're much more likely to be successful.
And I'm conscious that maybe I've been a bit negative towards the ultras. When you've maybe painted a different side that maybe a lot of us don't see. So, is there one type of ultra? Would you say is there a particular type of person that's attracted to it, or do you think people will be surprised? We may have, I don't know, say maybe a lawyer or a doctor that maybe people would not assume would be an ultra. Is it a more diverse range of people than is assumed and is portrayed to the masses?
I think it is. It is more diverse. I think they tend to be younger and they tend to be male, not without exception. And I think that's for two reasons. One, there is a certain element of physicality which is required to stand up and sing and in clouds of pyrotechnic smoke for 90 minutes. But also there's a level of acceptance. Being accepted, you're much more likely to be accepted into the group if you are youngish, in your late teens and 20s and 30s, and male. So so there's a demographic there, and at a lot of clubs it will also be your locality. If you're a local fan, you're much more likely to be welcomed. But yeah, in terms of it's not something that, for example, is class based. It's, you know, it's not not white collar. Sorry, it's not blue collar jobs anymore. Costs a lot of money going to football matches, so that's sort of the demographic situation. In terms of psychology, again, there isn't really any sort of, there's no psychological short wiring which leads people to go and do this. I prefer to look at this type of behavior as being an issue of transgression. It's about wanting to do something different from your ordinary life when it comes to a Saturday afternoon. And that's, to a certain extent, always been true of football fans. I always say people are perfectly reasonable during the week and can get all sweary and angry at watching a sport on a Saturday. And it's something that they like doing. It's an outlet. It's a form of transgression again. And you know, the comparisons, the contemporary comparisons are going on a stag do or whatever, and the comparisons looking back historically would be the feasts and festivals of early modern Europe, the old carnivals, where you'd have a day where you know, it's been described as cultural historians as the world turned inside out, or the world turned upside down, when the normal rules of hierarchy just don't apply, and everybody does whatever they want. So there's always been this sort of social need for human beings to transgress from what they do normally. And there's even a theory, it's not been tested, that this has a cathartic nature, that if you don't allow people to do this every now and again, then ultimately you're much more likely that you're going to get a full-scale rebellion against authority. Now, I've not seen any evidence that suggests that is true, but it's always been a theory that's been attached to this idea of the need for transgression. Ultimately, I just think it makes people happier. It gives people something to think about during the week when they might be bored at work. It gives them something to look forward to. It will, I'm sure, for many people, have tremendous mental health benefits.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very interesting you say that. I always wonder about other fans that maybe are in these stadiums, and the ultras are kind of seen as the uber fan, you know, the best fan, all this kind of stuff, and there's a lot of attention. Do you think other fans sometimes feel a little bit marginalised, that this group of fans get a lot of attention and maybe sort of prestige that the other fans who maybe go and, you know, do sing and do wear a scarf but are not ultras, or maybe slightly pushed to the side?
I mean, that's a really good question. I'm not aware off the top of my head of any research which would suggest that. Anecdotally, I was born in Manchester and taken to United games by my dad from being about 3 years old, and we would sit in the boring old North Stand. But my dad never had any interest in singing along, and he didn't want to stand on the Stretford end. We'd always get there, as would many other fans, an hour before kickoff, and he would always say, "Oh, let's get in early to hear the atmosphere." And he wanted to hear the build-up of the atmosphere pre-match, because of course the Stretford end would already be full, because you had to get in there early if you wanted to get a spot. And I think generally, you know, if you ask fans, and there is definitely research study in here to be had, you ask those fans that sit in those non-singing areas, their views on the noise making areas, be they ultra areas or not. I think they're always going to be positive. There may be some complaints about particular songs, there may be complaints about smoke bombs being set off that waft over. But I think generally, if you ask those fans, would you prefer that end behind the goal to be sat down like you, or would you prefer it to be standing up and singing? They would all, the vast majority would always say we want noise coming from that end.
And maybe sort of finally, I was also thinking of maybe the expansion of football. We've now got the MLS, which is, I mean, it's been around a while, but it's become more established, and we're seeing now Saudi Arabia building its league with Ronaldo and Benzema and stars like that going there. And I'm sure there'll be ultra groups that will spring up in these clubs if there's not already. I mean, I know there's some in America already, but they will spring up. What would be your sort of advice, or how do you see it going forward with those types of things, when maybe ultras haven't existed and these clubs didn't have that profile before? What would you think would be the best way of the ultras going forward? And do you think there's a place for in the modern world, or do you think it's more of a historical clubs? Maybe they're better suited to. They're not suited to these sort of new markets.
No, I think it's probably the other way around. I think if you look at clubs who have always had large followings and always created atmosphere at home and away games, there's less of a need for ultras. So, there isn't a specific ultra group responsible for atmosphere at the likes of Liverpool or Arsenal, for example, or Manchester United. And those sort of traditional clubs have always had ways of creating the noise anyway. So I think it is more for those newer clubs, all those developing clubs, all those clubs that have suddenly been catapulted up and more fans have started going, where you need almost a way of creating a structure in which fans can create a noise and can create a feeling of solidarity and individualized fandom around that club. So I think with those new clubs, it will be through the creation of ultra groups that primarily you will start to see atmosphere in those stadiums.
My final question, very, very briefly: ultra groups, good or bad?
On balance, I would always go good, because I always think if you disbanded ultra groups, and there have been attempts to disband ultra groups. It's happened in France, for example, with Paris Saint-Germain. Disbanding ultra groups doesn't get rid of the problems that you may have in terms of hate crime, or in terms of violence, or in terms of pyrotechnics. It just doesn't do that. Those people will still go. But you may well lose some of the benefits that you get from ultra groups in terms of self-regulation, in terms of liaison between the fans and the club to try and make stadiums better places for fans to attend, and also in getting rid of ultra groups, you will get rid of some of the benefits that they bring to the wider community. So things like ultra groups setting up food banks and raising money for charity and things like that. So if getting rid of ultra groups would get rid of violence at football, I think there would be a much more balanced argument. But I don't think that's what would happen. I don't think ultra groups are responsible for any post-pandemic increase in disorder in this country. So, generally we all have human rights to associate and assemble with whom we like if we're being peaceful. And I think there's a very good argument for allowing people to continue to associate as they see fit, unless you've got really, really strong evidence that it is a particular group that is causing a particular problem, which wouldn't arise anyway, otherwise.
It's been an eye-opener. Thank you so much, Professor Geoff Pearson at the University of Manchester. I think you've opened our eyes. It's been great to hear that both sides of the ultra thing. I think there is one narrative out there, and it's very heavily, and social media may plays a part in that. But I think you've you've certainly opened my eyes, and I'm sure a few others, to the many facets of ultra. So thank you very much.
It's been great speaking with you.